Texas, 1945. When the military trucks rolled through the gates of the converted ranch-turned-prisoner camp, the dust clouds seemed to carry whispers of dread. Among the exhausted faces pressed against the canvas was Takeshi Morimoto, 27, son of Osaka fishermen whose calloused hands had traded nets for rifle grips in a war that felt like someone else's nightmare. As the truck lurched to a stop, Takeshi's stomach gnawed at itself, a familiar companion since his capture 3 months earlier. He expected barbed wire, hunger, and the cold stares of men who saw him as less than human. What he didn't expect was the smell of mesquite smoke drifting across the Texas plains, carrying with it something that seemed impossible, the aroma of roasting meat. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we retell the forgotten human stories of war. The guards who opened the truck bed weren't the stone-faced sentries Takeshi had imagined. Sergeant Jim Crawford, a lanky cowboy from San Antonio, extended a weathered hand to help the prisoners down. "Easy there, partner," he said, his drawl thick as molasses. Takeshi hesitated, unsure if this kindness was a trap or a prelude to cruelty. But Crawford's eyes held no malice, only the patient steadiness of a man who had spent years gentling wild horses. Around them, other guards moved with similar calm, their rifles slung casually across their shoulders rather than pointed at trembling chests. The camp itself defied every horror story Takeshi had constructed in his mind during the long journey. Yes, there were fences, but they seemed more like ranch boundaries than prison walls. The barracks were simple but clean, with wooden floors instead of dirt and windows that actually opened to let in the evening breeze. As the prisoners were led toward their quarters, Takeshi caught sight of something that made him question his own eyes. American soldiers and a few early-released prisoners sitting around a fire pit, sharing what appeared to be an actual meal. "Supper time's in an hour," Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the compound. "Y'all must be hungry as a pack of coyotes." He gestured toward the fire where smoke curled up into the darkening sky. "We got beef cooking, beans, cornbread too. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." Takeshi's mouth watered involuntarily, even as his mind struggled to process the impossibility of what he was hearing. In the camps he'd heard whispered about, prisoners survived on watery rice and scraps. Here, someone was actually cooking meat and offering it to him. As they approached their assigned barrack, Takeshi noticed details that contradicted everything he'd been told about American prisoner camps. The building had a small porch where someone had placed 2 wooden chairs, as if inviting conversation rather than isolation. Wildflowers grew along the walkway, not the careful, controlled gardens of military precision, but the casual beauty of a place where someone had decided that even prisoners deserved to see something pretty. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. This was a place where men lived, not merely survived. The barrack itself was Spartanly furnished, but surprisingly comfortable. Each prisoner had his own cot with clean blankets, a small wooden crate for personal belongings, and most remarkably, a window beside each bed that looked out over the vast Texas landscape. As Takeshi set down his meager possessions, he caught sight of the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him painfully of sunsets over Osaka Bay. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than fear or despair. It was a fragile emotion, barely recognizable after months of suppression. Hope. The dinner bell rang across the compound with a clarity that cut through the evening air like a church chime. Takeshi's stomach responded before his mind could caution restraint, growling audibly in the quiet barrack. Around him, fellow prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. Was this real food or another psychological torment designed to break their spirits? But Sergeant Crawford appeared at the doorway, hat in hand, with the same patient demeanor he'd shown earlier. "Come on, boys," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a ranch foreman calling in the hands. "Grub's ready and it's getting cold. Nothing worse than cold barbecue, I can tell you that." He waited as the prisoners filed out, not rushing them but not allowing hesitation to build into fear. As they walked toward the fire pit, the aroma grew stronger, rich, smoky, with undertones of spices that spoke of care and attention rather than mere sustenance. The scene around the fire defied every preconception Takeshi had harbored about his captivity. American soldiers sat on logs and camp chairs alongside a handful of German and Italian prisoners who had obviously been here longer. Their faces bore the relaxed expressions of men sharing an evening meal rather than the tense vigilance of guards and prisoners. Corporal Billy Martinez, a compact man with Mexican heritage written in his features, was turning meat on a makeshift grill fashioned from an old barrel. First rule of cowboy cooking, he was explaining to a fascinated German prisoner. You never rush good beef. Takeshi found himself handed a metal plate. Not the crude tin dish he'd expected, but actual dinnerware, slightly dented, but clean. Crawford ladled a generous portion of barbecued beef onto it, followed by beans that smelled of molasses and bacon, and a thick slice of cornbread that was still warm to the touch. We got coffee too, Crawford offered, though I'll warn you, it's cowboy coffee, strong enough to wake a hibernating bear. The casual humor, the generous portions, the very normalcy of the interaction left Takeshi momentarily speechless. As he took his first bite, the flavors exploded across his palate with an intensity that nearly brought tears to his eyes. The beef was tender, seasoned with a smoky spice that spoke of hours over careful flames. The beans were rich and complex, nothing like the thin gruel he'd subsisted on during transport. And the cornbread, sweet, crumbly, with just enough grit to remind him of the rice cakes his mother used to make for festival days. It wasn't just food, it was a statement of respect, a declaration that even in captivity, a man deserved to eat like a human being. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story found you. It's curious to know how far these human memories reach. Around the fire, conversation flowed in a mixture of broken English, gestures, and the universal language of shared appreciation for good food. An Italian prisoner named Giuseppe was attempting to explain his grandmother's pasta recipe to Corporal Martinez, who listened with the serious attention of a student. A German engineer sketched improvements to the camp's water system in the dirt, while an American lieutenant nodded approvingly. These weren't the interactions between captors and captives, they were the conversations between men who had found common ground in the simple humanity of sharing a meal. As full darkness settled over the Texas landscape, someone produced a harmonica, and the soft strains of Red River Valley drifted across the compound. Takeshi, his belly full for the first time in months, found himself listening not to the melody, but to the silence between the notes. A peaceful quiet that spoke of safety, of respite, of the possibility that even in wartime, kindness could survive. The stars above seemed closer here, clearer than they had appeared through the smoke of battle or the desperation of capture. For tonight at least, the war felt very far away. Morning came with the gentle insistence of Texas sunshine, rather than the harsh clanging of prison bells. Takeshi woke naturally, his body having finally relaxed enough to sleep deeply for the first time since his capture. Through the window beside his cot, he could see American soldiers already at work, but their movements held the unhurried rhythm of ranch hands, rather than the rigid efficiency of military guards. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from the cook tent, accompanied by the sound of easy laughter and conversation. Sergeant Crawford appeared at the barrack door, but instead of barking orders, he simply announced, "Breakfast in 20 minutes, boys. We got work to do afterward, but nothing that'll break your backs." The casual tone, the consideration for their well-being, it continued to puzzle Takeshi, who had expected harsh commands and impossible tasks. As the prisoners made their way to the wash stations, he noticed that the soap provided was actual soap, not the harsh lye that stripped skin raw, and the towels, while well used, were clean and sufficient. The work assignments proved as surprising as everything else about this place. Instead of digging ditches or breaking rocks, Takeshi found himself assigned to the camp's small vegetable garden alongside Corporal Martinez and two other prisoners, Heinrich, a German baker, and Antonio, an Italian carpenter. "We're trying to grow some decent tomatoes," Martinez explained, kneeling beside a row of struggling plants. "But this Texas heat's been giving us trouble. Any of you boys know anything about growing things in hot weather?" Takeshi's heart jumped at the familiar subject. His family's fishing boat had always returned to a small garden behind their Osaka home, where his mother had coaxed vegetables from soil that seemed too salty and poor to sustain life. "In Japan," he said carefully, testing his English, "we use shade cloth and water in morning, evening, not in hot sun." Martinez's face lit up with genuine interest, not the patronizing attention of a captor humoring a prisoner, but the enthusiasm of a gardener meeting another gardener. For the next hour, they worked together in the growing heat, Takeshi demonstrating techniques his mother had taught him for protecting tender plants from harsh sun, while Heinrich shared methods for composting that he'd learned in his family's bakery garden, and Antonio explained how to build simple trellises that would support climbing beans. The work felt purposeful rather than punitive, and more importantly, it felt collaborative. When Martinez praised a particularly clever suggestion about plant spacing, Takeshi felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the Texas sun, the satisfaction of being valued for his knowledge rather than merely tolerated for his labor. The midday break brought another revelation. Instead of being herded back to barracks for a sparse meal, the work crews were invited to eat under a large canvas shade that had been erected near the main camp buildings. The meal was simple but generous: sandwiches made with fresh bread, cold lemonade that tasted like summer itself, and fruit that Crawford mentioned had come from the boys in town who heard we had some help with the garden. The casual mention that local civilians knew about the prisoners and had contributed food rather than demanded their removal spoke volumes about the kind of community that surrounded this place. As they ate, Crawford regaled them with stories about the ranch's history, how it had belonged to his grandfather, a cattle driver who had learned to respect the Mexican vaqueros who taught him everything about handling livestock. "Funny thing about cowboys," Crawford mused, his eyes twinkling with humor. "We learned early that it don't matter where a man comes from or what language his mama spoke to him. If he can sit a horse and handle cattle, he's got our respect." The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. In this makeshift community, competence and character mattered more than nationality or the circumstances that had brought them together. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a local physician who volunteered her services at the camp, arrived to check on the prisoner's health. But instead of the perfunctory medical examination Takeshi expected, Dr. Mitchell took time to actually listen to concerns, to explain treatment options, and to ensure that everyone understood their right to medical care. When she learned about Takeshi's persistent cough, a remnant from his time in overcrowded transport ships, she not only provided medicine, but also explained how the drier Texas air might help, and what symptoms to watch for that would require immediate attention. It was, Takeshi realized, the first time since his capture that someone with authority had treated him as a person whose well-being actually mattered. Evening had become Takeshi's favorite time in the camp, when the punishing heat of the Texas sun gave way to the gentle warmth of firelight, and the day's work yielded to the simple pleasure of shared company. Tonight, like many others, found him sitting on a log beside the fire pit, his belly full of Corporal Martinez's famous chili, and his mind more at ease than it had been since before the war began. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up towards stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear Texas sky. "Tell you what, Takeshi," Crawford said, settling onto a camp chair with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cooling air. "I've been wondering something. You mentioned your family fished back in Osaka. What kind of fishing? Deep sea or closer to shore?" The question carried genuine curiosity rather than interrogation, and Takeshi found himself relaxing into the familiar territory of talking about work he'd loved. "Small boats," Takeshi replied, his English growing more confident with each evening's conversation. "My father, he say ocean near Osaka, very, how do you say, full of fish, but dangerous too. Many rocks, strong waves. Need to know water very well." As he spoke, his hands moved instinctively, sketching the shape of nets and the motion of casting them into imaginary waters. Around the fire, others leaned in, drawn by the universal appeal of stories about working with nature's bounty. Heinrich, the German baker, nodded knowingly. "Is like bread," he said in his heavily accented English. "You must know the dough, feel when is ready. Cannot force, cannot rush. Ocean and bread, both have their own time." The comparison drew chuckles from the group, but also thoughtful nods. Crawford, who had spent his life reading weather patterns and cattle behavior, understood the patience required to work with forces beyond human control. "You know," Martinez said, poking at the fire with a long stick, "my grandfather was a fisherman too, down in Galveston. Used to tell stories about reading the water, how the color would tell you where the fish were running, how the wind would warn you about storms coming. Said the Gulf had its own language, and you had to learn to speak it or you'd end up swimming home." His eyes crinkled with memory as he added, "Course, Grandpa also claimed he could predict a woman's mood by the way clouds moved, so maybe don't take all his wisdom to the bank." The laughter that followed was genuine and inclusive, the kind that builds bridges between strangers. Takeshi found himself sharing more stories, about typhoons that had caught his father's boat far from shore, about the festival days when the fishing fleet would decorate their boats with colorful banners, about his mother's uncanny ability to know which fish would taste best just by looking at their eyes. In return, he heard Crawford's tales of cattle drives and drought years, Martinez's memories of his grandmother's kitchen where the tortillas were always perfect, Heinrich's descriptions of Christmas markets where his family's bakery was the heart of celebration. Antonio, who had been quietly whittling a piece of wood throughout the conversation, suddenly looked up and said, "You know what is funny? We all work with our hands. Fish, bread, cattle, wood, all need hands that know what they are doing." He held up his carving, a remarkably detailed horse that seemed to capture the spirit of the Texas landscape. "In Italy, my nonno, he say hands remember things brain forgets. Maybe that is why we understand each other here. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps Takeshi's story reach more people and remember what war tried to erase: humanity." As if summoned by the mention of memory, Crawford stood and walked to his quarters, returning with something wrapped in oiled cloth. "Speaking of hands remembering," he said, carefully unwrapping what proved to be an old guitar, its wood seasoned to a rich honey color by years of music making. "This belonged to my daddy. He played it on cattle drives around fires just like this one." His fingers found the familiar chords almost automatically, and the gentle strains of Beautiful Dreamer floated across the compound. The music seemed to unlock something in the gathered men. Heinrich began humming along in harmony, his baker's precision translating perfectly to musical timing. Antonio kept rhythm by tapping his carving knife against his boot. And Takeshi, surprising himself, began to add a counter-melody that he remembered from childhood festivals, the notes weaving together in a way that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did. Under the vast Texas sky, enemies became friends, strangers became brothers, and the fire burned not with the heat of war, but with the warmth of shared humanity. The last week of Takeshi's time at the camp arrived with the suddenness of Texas weather, one day distant on the horizon, the next bearing down with the inevitability of a thunderstorm. News had come that arrangements were being made for repatriation, that soon the prisoners would begin the long journey back to whatever remained of their former lives. The news should have brought relief, even joy, But Takeshi found himself strangely reluctant to leave this place where he had rediscovered what it meant to be treated as a human being. The morning of his departure, he rose before dawn, drawn by some inexplicable need to see the Texas sunrise one last time from this place that had given him back his sense of worth. The camp was quiet, except for the gentle sounds of early morning, distant cattle lowing, the soft whisper of wind through the mesquite trees, the occasional clink of metal as the cook prepared breakfast. As he stood near the garden, they had all tended together. Takeshi marveled at how much the plants had grown under their care, how the techniques shared between former enemies had created something beautiful and productive. "Figured I'd find you here." Crawford's voice carried the familiar warmth that had characterized every interaction since that first day. He approached carrying 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought you some of that cowboy coffee you got so fond of. Thought maybe we could watch the sun come up together, one last time." They stood in comfortable silence as the sky lightened from deep purple to pink to gold, the Texas landscape revealing itself in all its harsh beauty. Finally, Crawford cleared his throat and held out the bundle. "Got something for you, partner. Not much, but, well, it seemed right." His weathered hands trembled slightly as he passed the package to Takeshi, betraying an emotion that his steady voice hadn't revealed. Inside the cloth wrapping was a cowboy hat, not new, but well cared for, with a band made from braided leather and a crown shaped by years of honest wear. "Belonged to my younger brother," Crawford explained quietly. "He didn't make it back from Normandy, but before he shipped out, he said something I've never forgotten. He said that every man deserves to face the world with his head held high, no matter what storms have blown through his life." Crawford's eyes met Takeshi's directly. "You've got that dignity, son. Had it when you arrived, kept it while you were here, and you'll carry it wherever you go next." The hat fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, this person. As Takeshi adjusted the brim, he caught sight of his reflection in the cook tent's window and barely recognized the man looking back at him. Gone was the defeated prisoner who had arrived months earlier, replaced by someone who stood straighter, whose eyes held hope instead of despair, whose face bore the easy confidence of a man who knew his own worth. "Sergeant Crawford," Takeshi began, then stopped, struggling to find words in any language for what he wanted to express. Finally, he simply said, "You teach me that enemy can become friend. That respect is, how do you say, stronger than war." He touched the brim of the hat in a gesture that felt natural, right? "I never forget this place. Never forget Cowboy who shared barbecue with Japanese fishermen." The truck that would take the departing prisoners to the train station arrived as the sun reached its full morning strength. As Takeshi climbed into the back, he carried with him more than just his few possessions and his new hat. He carried the memory of Heinrich's bread lessons, Antonio's wood-carving wisdom, Martinez's garden techniques, and Crawford's quiet demonstration that courage sometimes looked like kindness rather than combat. He carried the knowledge that even in the midst of humanity's darkest chapter, individuals could choose to write different stories. Years later, Takeshi would establish a small fishing guide service on the coast near his rebuilt hometown. Visitors were always struck by the weathered cowboy hat that hung prominently in his office, and by his habit of serving coffee and simple food to anyone who seemed hungry or lost. When asked about the hat, he would always tell the story of a Texas camp where enemies learned to see each other as men, where barbecue and respect were served in equal portions, and where he learned that the best victories are won not through conquest, but through compassion. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part touched you most, because sometimes peace begins when we retell the past with empathy. 53 years after the last barbecue fire flickered out at that Texas prison camp, Takeshi Morimoto stood in his small fishing guide office in rebuilt Osaka, carefully adjusting the same weathered cowboy hat that had become his most treasured possession. At 80 years old, his hands moved with the practiced precision of decades spent reading water and weather, but they trembled slightly as he touched the braided leather band. Not from age, but from the weight of memory. The office walls told the story of an extraordinary life rebuilt from the ashes of war. Photographs showed him teaching American tourists to fish in Osaka Bay, sharing meals with visitors from every corner of the world, and always wearing that distinctive Texas hat that seemed so incongruous against the backdrop of Japanese fishing boats and ancient temples. But those who knew Takeshi's story understood that the hat wasn't an oddity. It was a bridge between worlds, a symbol of the moment when an enemy became a friend and a prisoner discovered his own worth. Today was different from the countless other days he'd spent guiding visitors through the waters his father had taught him to navigate. Today, 3 elderly American men had chartered his boat, men whose names he had learned from letters that had crossed oceans for 5 decades. Jim Crawford's grandson had finally made the pilgrimage his grandfather had spoken of before his death 10 years earlier, bringing with him Billy Martinez Jr. and Heinrich Weber's son, Carl, children of the men who had shared barbecue and stories around a Texas fire when the world was bleeding. "Mr. Morimoto," the younger Crawford said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had characterized his grandfather's speech. "Grandpa Jim made me promise to give you something if I ever made it to Japan." From a carefully wrapped package, he produced another hat, newer than Takeshi's beloved original, but clearly cut from the same pattern, shaped by the same understanding of what it meant to face the world with dignity intact. Through tears that he didn't try to hide, Takeshi accepted the gift and learned the rest of the story he'd never known. Crawford had returned to Texas after the war and transformed the old prison camp into a ranch that specialized in helping troubled veterans readjust to civilian life. He'd used the lessons learned from treating former enemies with respect to create a place where broken soldiers could remember their own humanity. The garden techniques Takeshi had shared lived on in the ranch's vegetable plots. Heinrich's composting methods had enriched Texas soil for generations. Antonio's woodworking wisdom had built countless cabins for healing men. But more than techniques had survived. The spirit of that place, the revolutionary idea that enemies could share meals and stories, that respect could transcend nationality, that barbecue and brotherhood could coexist even in wartime, had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Crawford had trained other camp administrators who carried those methods to different facilities. Martinez had opened his home to displaced persons after the war, teaching them English over plates of his grandmother's recipes. Heinrich had returned to Germany and built a bakery that became famous not just for its bread, but for its policy of never turning away anyone who was hungry. As they sailed across Osaka Bay that afternoon, 4 old men and the ghosts of their fathers shared stories that spanned continents and decades. Takeshi's clients learned about the fishing festivals his family had celebrated before the war, about the patient art of reading currents and tides, about the way sunrise over water could make a man remember why life was worth living. In return, they shared memories passed down from their fathers, Crawford's tales of cattle drives and drought years, Martinez's stories of border cooking and cross-cultural friendship, Heinrich's descriptions of Christmas markets where former enemies had become customers and then friends. The sun was setting as they returned to harbor, painting the sky in shades that reminded Takeshi powerfully of that first Texas evening when he dared to hope that kindness might survive war. As his guests prepared to leave, each of them pressed something into his weathered hands, photographs of their families, addresses written in careful script, invitations to visit ranches and bakeries and homes across America where the spirit of that long-ago camp continued to flourish. That evening, alone in his office, Takeshi carefully placed the new hat beside the old one and wrote in his journal, a practice he'd maintained since learning English from patient cowboys around a Texas fire. Today, I learned that the barbecue we shared in 1945 is still feeding people. The respect we discovered behind wire fences has built bridges across the world. The friendship born from fear and hunger has grown into something bigger than any of us imagined. He paused, looking out at the lights of Osaka Harbor, then continued writing. Crawford-san once said that every man deserves to face the world with his head held high. Tonight, I understand that some gifts keep giving long after the giver has gone home. The hat he gave me didn't just protect me from the sun. It protected me from forgetting that enemies can become brothers, that dignity survives even war, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is an invitation to share a meal. Outside his window, Osaka Bay reflected the lights of a city rebuilt from rubble, a nation reconstructed from defeat, a world that had somehow managed to find its way back from the edge of complete darkness. And in a small office overlooking those waters, an old fisherman wearing a Texas cowboy hat continued to prove, one guided trip at a time, that the best victories are won not through conquest, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating every human being, even former enemies, with the dignity they deserved simply by virtue of being alive. The legacy lived on, seasoned with mesquite smoke and sweetened with the kind of respect that transcends borders, languages, and the artificial divisions that nations create when they forget that beneath every uniform beats the heart of someone's son, someone's father, someone's hope for a better tomorrow.